All right, let's talk about the history of both the US dollar and Bitcoin. To understand why Bitcoin came to be, you need to understand about the history of the current global currency and how it's no longer what it once was. US dollar history. So in 1944, the US dollar became the world's currency backed by the world's largest gold reserves, and in 1971, the US dollar became no longer backed by gold. So there was no hard asset that the dollar was backed by, and in 2020 during COVID, the Fed printed actually 80% of the current US dollar supply, which is called money printing, and this was distributed through stimulus checks. Well, adding to the total supply of the US dollar actually means that the actual value of the money is devalued by the amount added, rendering the value of any previously saved money worth less than what it was before the total supply was added to. How society usually sees the repercussions of this is through increased prices on goods and services, which we know as inflation. Who makes decisions for the US dollar? That is the Federal Reserve, which is an appointed group of officials by the government. Not even the citizens have a say of who is appointed. It is the government, and they affect the whole global economy. Now, the value is derived based on the economy and the exchange of goods, and now the value is derived based on the economy and the exchange of those goods and services and the monetary policies that are put in place via legislation. Bitcoin is 15 years old, and it was created by an individual or a group of anonymous people called Satoshi Nakamoto, and they released the code online in 2009 and started the network after the 2008 financial banking crisis. As of now, there is institutional adoption already, and you'll see services like Bitcoin ETFs or banks allowing you the option to buy Bitcoin, or government or companies acquiring large amounts of Bitcoin. The decisions are made by the entirety of the network, the global distributed network, also known as the decentralized network. No one actually solely runs it. It's based on the computers that are available and willing to contribute to the network. In hindsight, you could contribute your computer and run the necessary software to contribute to the network. How is Bitcoin's value derived? The value is derived based on people trading for those goods and services or purchasing Bitcoin at a specific price point. And you can take into factor of circulating supply and distribution, which we'll get into how Bitcoin is distributed and how that leads up to the total of 21 million in a little bit. And Bitcoin holds its own value against each currency, whether it's gold, real estate, or a fiat currency. Now, how much is $1 actually worth after we printed during COVID? So whether it's $1 or $10,000, the value of the dollar has drastically reduced. So when they printed 80% of the money supply, you can see here that $1 is significantly less because you're dividing it over the total supply amount itself. And you can see that inflation picks up in terms of cost of goods and services, or shrinkflation, which is the reduction of the goods and services provided for that same amount. And that's why wages are in need of an increase as well, because of the increased amount of total supply. And what we do see in terms of the amount of money that was printed is the large gap, which is the amount of profit that's taken by companies versus the people who are living paycheck to paycheck. What are the factors to a depreciating dollar? There's no infinite supply, so they can just add to the supply. And then secondly, it's no longer backed by gold, so that causes the reduction of the actual value of the dollar itself. The biggest problem with depreciating dollar is that you would have to earn more for the same goods and services, which end up costing you more over time in terms of whether it's your time spent earning for that money or using more of your money for the same goods and services. It's a never-ending cycle. The purchasing power of a dollar in 1913 is the same as $26 now. As you can see, the value of $1 has drastically lost its value, especially after, one, we no longer had US dollar backed by gold, and then two, they printed 80% of the monetary supply during 2020 COVID. You can get less and less over time with that same $1. So how the US dollar has lost value, Bitcoin has actually gained value despite the volatility that we see. 1 Bitcoin will always be equivalent to 1 Bitcoin. The way Bitcoin is valued is you'll spend less of that Bitcoin over time for the same goods and services. Here's how $1 is actually worth 26. Here, how $1 here is actually worth $26 for that same amount, right? With Bitcoin, over time, the more Bitcoin you've acquired, the less you'll spend of that Bitcoin later on for the same goods and services. So unlike the US dollar, which has lost value, Bitcoin gains value. There's a higher purchasing power. So going into the supply, Bitcoin has a fixed supply of 21 million Bitcoin that can never exist. How can everyone get a full Bitcoin? Well, they can't. That's why we have subunits called Satoshis. There's 100 million Satoshis to 1 Bitcoin, which is equivalent to 8 places behind the decimal point. So 1 Satoshi is equivalent to 0.00000001 Bitcoin. If you're interested, you could do conversion exercises to quickly learn and convert later on, but that's not necessary. In this chart, you can see that the supply is reduced over time. In Bitcoin, based on Bitcoin's supply and issuance schedule, the majority of Bitcoin was mined into existence in the beginning of when Bitcoin was created in the first 15 years. While in the next 116 years, the remaining 6% will be added to the supply. Not all 21 million Bitcoin is in circulation yet. We will get there, but we are currently on about 20 million. So every 210,000 blocks, we have something called a Bitcoin halving, which means that the reward of Bitcoin that is unlocked for adding a block to the blockchain is reduced. It drives disbursement of Bitcoin over time, and the value increases per Bitcoin rather than losing value, which the dollar does. So to understand the purchasing power of Bitcoin, let's look at the example of Bitcoin pizza. This is a very infamous example. A Florida resident posted asking to exchange 2 pizzas delivered for 10,000 Bitcoin as a payment. And this ended up being the first exchange of Bitcoin for goods and services. So 10,000 Bitcoin at that time was valued at $40, and it was much harder to use the network, not as user-friendly, and there's only about 5 million Bitcoin in circulation at that time. Fast forward to now, that 10,000 Bitcoin is actually valued at $970 million. But now there is 20 million Bitcoin in circulation as opposed to back then when there was only 5. The value of Bitcoin has changed in the way that Bitcoin is used and adopted in society, and that has also changed. So how will this affect you? How does the US dollar depreciating and how does Bitcoin being around affect you? Well, this affects you because most people are losing trust in the government and the current systems for the value of their dollar or the value of their hard-earned money to actually go further for them, especially because we are moving into a society that is continuously polluted and we are moving to a higher lack of resources. Bitcoin will and most likely become the next global currency because of its decentralization and its freedom properties. There is no single point of persuasion and it's borderless. And Bitcoin, no matter where you start, will add up over time. Developers and people dedicate their lives and their careers to building on the Bitcoin network, which in turn benefits everyone globally. The development to improve the functionality and usability of Bitcoin core code requires development consensus and rigorous testing, which means that any changes that go in will affect everyone, and so they are very stringent about what they put through. The dollar itself is losing value and prices are rising, and people really do need to be able to afford things in which they've saved over time, and just traditional savings and retirement accounts just have not accounted for inflation and currently are not accounting for that hyperinflation, especially with where we've printed during COVID. When you look at people who've worked in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, that money is not the same as what it was, and it will not get you there as what it once has. Bitcoin is being dispersed to more and more people through adoption, ETFs, institutional adoption, the use of it as legal tender, as utility in different countries amongst different groups for different reasons, whether that's political or economic. And Bitcoin over time is considered the same thing as what it was. And through the decreased amount of Bitcoin over time through block reward, 1 Bitcoin will always be equivalent to 1 Bitcoin. You'll just have to spend less of it over time for the goods and services as to when you have acquired it.